respond to one another.
Lord, that sounds like a step too far, I think. Well, if you're going to ask people to ask questions, surely they should.
We will get questions later on, but we.
Well, I'll just make one point. Andrew, in the example of the pushing, you say that you should be liable for a push, but not for the manslaughter. Is that right? Not for killing? Is that what it is? But on your argument you were putting right at the start, shouldn't you be liable only for the attempt to assault?
Well, yes, yes,
right.
yes, right.
Yeah, I just wanted to.
It doesn't even matter whether the person gets pushed.
No.
Well, it is very difficult. If you're going to stop the action just as the person is about,
well,
that's my point. That all doings are attempts, but you wouldn't normally call them that.
That's it.
I'd rather just wait and see what comes up in discussion. I don't have an answer to either of these formidable papers.
This is the most clear, the panel in which we have the most clear form of disagreement. All three people have very different views, which are very clearly different from one another.
That's why we have dialogue.
Yeah. Okay.
I didn't understand a word each other said.
Sure.
I can apply Professor Ashworth's ideas to the promise example that you gave. In the case where I actually promised to meet at noon, but because of factors outside my I did endeavor to meet in all reasonable circumstances, but there was a big animal rights protest, the roads were blocked, I couldn't, and I was late. Would you say that I have broken the promise, I've not kept my promise, or and deal with the question of whether my not keeping the promise was justified at a later stage, or have I, in endeavoring to keep my promise, not broken it? Because and whether the fact that you consider justification separately to breaking the promise or within promise itself only semantic or not, because that could come to the core of.
Oh, okay, that's very useful. It's a sort of additional layer of complications. So I didn't want to advance a particular interpretation of any particular promise, right? I mean, I was leaving that to you to interpret promises and to ask yourself the question: are there two ways of interpreting the promise? All right, such that some of them might be interpreted as promises to show up at noon, and others might be interpreted as promises to use your best endeavors to show up at noon. Now, if you think there could be, in principle, a question of interpretation of a promise such that it could turn out to be either of those, then you've already given me what I need, namely the logical space for there to be duties that are orientated towards or constituted by the way your actions turn out, and duties that are orientated toward or constituted by the endeavor or input. So that was all I needed. Now, what you've added, if I understand you right, is that even if we interpreted the promise so that it is a promise to show up at noon, we might still have other questions we want to ask after that. So when I phone up and say, I'm sorry, I didn't get there, we might reasonably say, well, why didn't you get there? Did you have a good reason? And we might be more sympathetic towards or more willing to accept atonement from or apology from somebody who said, I couldn't get there because there was an animal rights protest, than from somebody who said, I couldn't get there because I walked too slowly. Or I couldn't be bothered to get up this morning. Right? Now there's more than one thing going on there, but one thing that might be going on is that for some purposes and in some contexts we allow people to justify or excuse their breach of their promises. I don't think we allow them to do that for all purposes. So suppose somebody promised that they were going to deliver you a package like FedEx, right? And they had promised they were going to deliver it to you by noon. And they phoned up, very unlikely because they never do. But suppose, mirabile dictu, they phone up, right? And they say, sorry, we didn't make it by noon because there was an explosion on the M40, right? We'd be sympathetic, but we still expect them to hurry up, right? And in fact, we might still insist on the compensation clause, you know, so long as it didn't exclude explosions on the M40, right? So there are some normative consequences that aren't touched by excuses and justifications in the way that others are. But I'm granting to Andrew and others that punishment is sensitive to excuse and justification. So I'm happy for that to be true. But I was interested in a prior question. I don't want to jump the gun. I don't want anybody to jump the gun. I was interested in a prior question whether, nevertheless, before we get to justification and excuse, there are two kinds of duties with two ways, therefore, of wronging people. And if you're with me that the promise is open to interpretation on that score, then you're with me that there are two kinds of duties with two ways of wronging people, which is the only act I had to grant.